So I've already touched on these ideas a number of times, but it can't hurt to reiterate them again, that Merleau-Ponty is critiquing these classical prejudices. And so the introduction to the phenomenology of perception is all about uncovering the problems and insolvable problems, basically, involved in the worldview, which he calls the classical prejudices. And these are systemic to intellectualism and empiricism. And basically, they look at the world as a geometric totality of things, right? So taking Kant, we have already filtered all of our experience through space and time and concepts. And space and time are geometrical and concepts are logical. So everything in the world, if it makes sense, has to be falling into those categories of geometrical space and logical concepts. And for the empiricist, it's a lot of those intellectual elements are there, but it's not about our consciousness constituting objects. It's about atomic sense data, little bits of data coming into our mind and being put together into images by our mind. And that's the whole. So there's two big ideas there. The first one is atomic sense data. So Hume talks about this. If you put a dot on a piece of paper and you have someone looking at it and you move that paper away, at a certain point you're going to get far enough away where the dot is no longer perceptible. Then you move it forward a little bit until suddenly it's sensible. And so Hume says that moment of its visibility is the smallest possible sensible data and is therefore an atomic sense data. And immediately Merleau-Ponty and Gestalt psychologists would say, no, all this does is prove a figure-background relationship. But we'll get more into that criticism in a little bit. And the other main problem with this kind of empiricist view, it can also be called sensationalism, is that, and this comes from Locke, that there are primary and secondary qualities. A primary quality is purely mechanical and extended reality. It's like Descartes' res extensa. There's no warmth, there's no color, there's no texture, there's no softness, there's nothing like that. All you have is mechanical causes without any perceptual or sensitive or consciousness within it. And then secondary qualities are all of those things that we feel, all the things that I just excluded from the primary qualities. And Whitehead calls that the bifurcation of nature. And this bifurcation of nature and the atomic sense data together form the worldview or the classical prejudice of the empiricists. So empirical psychology treats sensations as the reception of data, of these atomic sense data. And they're this undifferentiated, instantaneous, punctual jolts of information, basically. And the constancy hypothesis will say that between the mechanical causality on the side of the sensible object and the experience of that sensation as a kind of, secondary property, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the source of the sensation as an extended object and the perception we have of it as a, quality of a secondary quality of whatever sort, warmth, brightness, things like that. And this is closely related to a phrase that Merleau-Ponty uses really often that he gets from Leibniz, partes extra partes, which means parts outside of parts. Extended being, extended objects, a world of a geometrical totality is things outside of each other. There's no interconnection between any objects. There's no organization among objects. It's always partes extra partes. It's always things outside of each other, parts outside of parts. You can think here of atomism. Atoms are all separated and individuated and discrete, at least in a certain worldview of that. So perception in this, classical prejudice is an encounter with an alien world. So our consciousness, in which we have secondary properties, is utterly unlike the world that we experience. This is the contrast between an in itself and a for itself. The world as something wholly other than our consciousness. So Gestalt theory reframes the basic structure of sensory experience by describing the transcendental structures of that appearing, right? Instead of going directly for this sensual content and analyzing it into atomic data, they look at the very structure of our sense making in perception, and the most important aspect of that is this figure background relationship. What appears always already has a figure background structure and always has a sense, a meaning based on that kind of structure. Perception requires that we recognize this kind of indeterminate background as a positive phenomenon, essential to all perception. When we look into perception as a phenomenon, not theoretically as the empiricist does, but phenomenologically, and the Gestalt psychologists were already sort of doing phenomenology. When we do that, we are able to discover within perception gestalts and open systems of perceiving that really eliminate the whole paradigm of empiricism and this atomic sense data, all of that theory. None of these features of figure background or indeterminacy or anything like that are explicit phenomena. None of them can be reduced to data of our experience. None of them is a thing in our experience. They're not things we directly perceive, right? They're the medium through which we perceive things. They're the structure in which perceptions emerge. They're the patterns that perceptions abide by.